Welcome to Sobol Says for Parshas Vayera. Today we will briefly span the Parsha, making our usual stops along the way, and then we will come back to focus on the bookends of the Parsha, the first and last topics. So this week's Parsha really kind of begins in last week's Parsha, and by that I mean it's truly mid-conversation where it begins. At the end of last week's Parsha, if you just see on page 316, if you are following along this week, I would exercise your fingers a little bit. They'll need some nimbleness because we might be flipping a bunch. So at the end of last week's Parsha, the last three psukim, 22, 23, and then the beginning of the next parak, is basically telling us, I'll just read it in English for brevity, that Moshe returns to Hashem and says, why? Although it actually pays to say this in Hebrew because this is a very critical phrase in general. Vayashav Moshe al Hashem vayomar Hashem lama hareosa lama zeh shalachtani. Why have you done evil to this people? Why have you sent me? And then Moshe goes on to complain, from the time that I came to Paro, he's only done evil to the people. You did not rescue your people. And then Hashem says to Moshe, now you're going to see what I'm going to do to Paro, for through a strong hand he'll send them out, and a strong hand he will drive them from his land. And then continues the conversation into this week's Parsha. So I do that for you only because it's important to know that background so we can focus a little bit better on the first couple of psukim in this week's Parsha. So Moshe has basically shown his frustration over the turn of events and the further misfortune of the Jews. Moshe had assumed that at least his initial mission to Paro would produce some sort of positive results. Obviously, he understood it wasn't going to be a one and done. Hi, Paro, I'm here. Okay, no problem. Let your people go. But Moshe assumed, okay, we'll be inching towards that at least, and instead the opposite occurs. Things actually get worse for the Jews after that. So Hashem is clearly irritated by Moshe's requests. Paro is irritated by Moshe's requests, and he increases the Jews' burdens and makes us now, as we've said previously, not just do the same amount of work, but now we were responsible to provide our own supplies in conjunction with that. So things have gotten much worse, and so then Moshe complains to Hashem, and Hashem responds, and that is how our Parsha begins. So let's just look at the first two psukim and the Rashis on them, and begin our analysis. Vaydaber Elokim el Moshe, vayomer elav ani Hashem. Okay, it is important actually to note the Hebrew, specifically the way Hashem is described. And by described, I mean the different names that are used with respect to Hashem, because often they speak of a different attribute of God's that is being displayed. So it says, Vaydaber Elokim el Moshe. Vaydaber, as we know, is usually harsh words, or can be harsh words, Dvar. And Elokim is Hashem in his capacity of a strict judge. And he said, Ani Hashem. But he says, Ani Hashem using his ineffable name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. And then he says, Vayra el Abraham el Yitzchak vel Yaakov bekel shakai, ushmi Hashem lo nodati lahem. So that's why I'm emphasizing to you it's important to actually look at the names of Hashem in these psukim, because you will see a lot of different names of Hashem on display. We see Elokim, we see the Yud Kei Vav Kei. Then Hashem tells Moshe that he was known to his forefathers with the name Kel Shakai, that's Aleph Lamed, and then Shin Daled Yud, which is displaying a different attribute of Hashem's. Ushmi Hashem, but my name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, God's ineffable name, Lo Nodati Lahem, they did not know that name. So there is much to say just on these two psukim. And of course, we go first and foremost to Rashi, who will begin our analysis for us. So Rashi says, Vaydaber Elokim el Moshe, Dabirito mishpat al shehiksha ledaber v'lomar lama hareosem lama hazeh. So Hashem uses harsh language. He takes Moshe to task, so to speak, for having spoken critically and said, why have you caused this people to be mistreated? Again, speaking from last week's Parsha at the very end, Moshe questions why Hashem is allowing these people, meaning Bnei Yisrael, to be so severely punished, so severely mistreated, and he acts up. So this is telling us, first and foremost, this is God's response to Moshe's complaint. And then the second pasuk, Vayumar, I love Ani Hashem, Hashem Yud Kei Vav, okay? Neman l'shalem sachar tov l'mishalchim lefanai. So first you should know, Moshe, I am faithful to pay good reward to those who follow me closely. So let's establish those ground rules first and foremost. Hashem rewards those that follow in his ways. Lo lechinam shalachticha, ki im lekayim divrei shedibarti la'avos harishonim. Now, in what seems to be not only an explanation, but perhaps a little shtuch to Moshe, Hashem also says, not for nothing did I send you, but rather, so that's a plain answer, meaning there is a purpose to it, but then Hashem says, but rather to fulfill the promises that I had made to your forefathers. And that's a little bit of shtuch, meaning Hashem is saying, listen, Moshe, this is not all about you. Just so you know, don't question my judgment. Don't question my cheshbonos, my calculations. You should know, in fact, reward will be paid accordingly. And anyway, my purpose in sending you is to fulfill the promises I made to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So clearly, Hashem was not so happy with Moshe because of him questioning the situation, and Hashem responds accordingly. So we're going to come back to that a little later on. Then Moshe tells Bnei Yisrael again that Hashem will redeem them, but the Torah tells us that they did not listen to Moshe because of their shortness of breath and the hard work. Right? The Kotza Ruach, the Avodah Kasha, those prevented them from hearing Moshe and his prediction that in fact they will be redeemed very shortly. Moshe then complains to Hashem that they're not listening, and after that Hashem commands him to speak to Paro. And Moshe says that if Bnei Yisrael did not listen to me, then certainly Paro will not listen to me. Now this is interesting. If you turn to page 320, Pasuk 12, on that very Pasuk, when Moshe says, Moshe spoke for Hashem, saying, behold, the children of Israel have not listened to me, so how will Paro listen to me? What does Rashi say on that? What was Moshe saying precisely? Rashi says, Ve'ech yishme'eni Paro, ze'echad me'asara kal v'chomer shebetorah. Rashi gives us a very interesting piece of information. Rashi tells me this statement by Moshe, this argument, is one of 10 places in the Torah that a kal v'chomer is used. Now, a kal v'chomer, an a fortiori argument, quite simply, I'm sure most of you already know this, but just in case, the most simple example is if A is larger than B, and B is larger than C, then kal v'chomer, how much more so is A larger than C? That's how a simple kal v'chomer works. Now, the thing about kal v'chomers that you must know is they must be unassailable. The logic must be perfect. It can't be questioned. If there is any kind of pircha, any kind of flaw or a hole that you can make in the kal v'chomer, then, in fact, it does not qualify as a kal v'chomer. Which is why that it's quite surprising that Rashi tells us that this is one of the 10 instances of a kal v'chomer in the Torah, because, okay, so why does Rashi tell us it's a kal v'chomer? So this is the thinking. Moshe's argument was that if Bnei Yisrael, who's being told good news, that they're going to be redeemed, and that would give them a lot of hope. They don't listen to me. Then how much more so Paro, who's getting bad news, how much more so is he not going to listen to me? And while it may or may not make logical sense to you, that argument, I can at least sort of see the logic in it, but many Mefarshim take issue with Moshe's argument because it seems to have a fatal flaw. And what is that? Well, we simply just said that the reason why Bnei Yisrael did not listen to Moshe was because of their shortness of breath, their very hard work. That's why they were unable to listen to Moshe. But Paro, on the other hand, had no such factor preventing him from hearing. I understand. Bnei Yisrael were overwhelmed with their work. They didn't have time to take a break to listen to Moshe. Or even if they could hear the words, they had no time to concentrate on them, let alone accept them, because they're in the middle of trying to make their quota for the day. Paro, on the other hand, sitting there luxuriously in the palace, has no such impediments to his ability to hear what Moshe is saying. So really, it's not a very good Kal V'chomer. And yes, it's true, perhaps, and it actually was the case, that Paro will not listen. Okay, it turns out he won't listen, but it's not a Kal V'chomer. So why do we say that that is, in fact, a Kal V'chomer? Maybe just the fact that Paro does not have the slavery factor in his life will allow him to hear Moshe's words. So a number of different commentators propose different answers on this, but perhaps we can suggest one based on something I saw from Rabbi Eliyahu Hoffman. We can suggest that what Moshe was saying was that because the Jews did not listen, because they didn't listen, it guaranteed that Paro would not. How does that work? So overall, we like to think of ourselves as good people who try to do the will of God. We have our good days and our bad days, of course, but as a general rule, we try to do God's will. But when things are very rough for us, when we're exhausted and overwhelmed, sometimes we have to concede defeat. We just say, like, you know what, God, I can't get it together today. I have too much stress. I'm wiped out. I'm overwhelmed, whatever the case may be. So in those situations, right, so even when we're going to be a good servant to Hashem, we get tired, irritated, hungry, thirsty, and those things in some way are impediments to our proper service of Hashem. And of course, in those moments of human and understandable weakness, our ability to properly serve Hashem becomes diminished. We do what we can. We try hard, but sometimes we're too overwhelmed and we need to catch our breath before moving forward. The Be'er Mayim Chayim calls this serving Hashem within the limits of nature. And that means we must acknowledge we're humans, we are physical beings. For whatever reason, Hashem has programmed the world in this way that we need certain basic necessities in order to give us strength. And when we are either missing them or other factors occur in our life and we can't serve Hashem properly, okay, that's called serving Hashem within the limits of nature. We try to serve Hashem. Sometimes our natural state prevents us from doing that. And it is at those very moments, if we otherwise do try hard to serve Hashem, that Hashem in His mercy sometimes gives us a break and pushes us over the top when we can't get there alone. But it's usually just a small nudge that's given and required. But it would normally not warrant Hashem giving us an openly miraculous surge forward by removing all obstacles in our way. In other words, you woke up this morning and you were really tired. You were so tired, you're thinking, Minyan is not in my offing this morning. I'm sorry, God, what do you want? I got to bed very late last night. I'm so tired. But I would love to go to Minyan. And God knows that. I go to Minyan all the time. Today, I just don't have the strength. So it turns out, though, that my wife, last night when she was making the coffee, accidentally or not accidentally, put in 2 more scoops of coffee into the coffee maker. And I drink that coffee now, and pow! I've got the power, and I'm right out the door, and I make it to Minyan. That would be a classic example of Hashem allowing us to serve Him within the limits of nature. We needed a little push, right? God didn't just miraculously clear the way and you show up in shul that moment. He gave us a little nudge. He made the coffee a little stronger, and somehow we had that extra oomph to get there. However, as we've seen through many stories in the Gemara, and I'm sure in our lives as well, when people have exceeded their capacity, when notwithstanding the natural limitations and understandable inabilities, they rise above, then Hashem may very well openly and miraculously remove the barriers, right? Those are in certain circumstances where we can't do it, but we really reach deep down inside and say, I'm doing this anyway. And Hashem very often will remove the obstacles from us. I recall, and this is just a small nugget, but I recall one of the years I was in Avelis for my parents. I think it was for my mother, actually. So I had been, it was a visiting day in the summer at camp. And for those of you who know what it's like over there, the afternoon drive back home to New York is nothing short of treacherous. It is what it turns a 2.5 hour drive or a 2 hour drive into like a 5 hour drive. It's really unbearable. And I had davened mincha. I am one of those people that is crazy when it comes to Kaddish for my parents and davening for the Amud. I really, less than on one hand could I count the times I missed minyan for my mother or my father in the year of Avelis. And that afternoon, I davened mincha in camp before we left. And then I hopped into my car with friends of ours. We were following them. We were going back to New York. We were going to go out to eat, but I told them we must grab a Mara first. And it was getting late, and we're driving, and I'm following my friend. This was before Waze, or before Waze were valent, and he was my Waze, taking back roads. We're doing side stuff. We're doing crazy stuff. I am pushing the limits. Pushing the limits. And we get into town. And it's not looking very good. And of course it's raining also. They're like, whatever could happen, happens. And yet somehow, still keep moving forward, And we get to the shul in his town. Literally after a 5-hour drive, get into shul, open the doors, v'hu they're literally starting Ma'ariv at that moment. That is an example of wanting to do something so badly where sometimes Hashem removes all the obstacles. Yes, there were a lot of cars in the way, but I mean, I could have been 5 minutes. In 5 hours, what's 5 minutes? And yet, Hashem delivered it on time. That's the difference between the two of those things. So, sometimes Hashem miraculously removes the barriers. And that may be what Moshe was saying. Yes, Bnei Yisrael was subject to backbreaking work that had simply overwhelmed them. The barriers to their freedom were immense. Moshe felt, though, that an opportunity had presented itself, whereby if he could only get them to listen to his message, right? They were as down as it gets. The work was overbearing. They had no reason to hope. But if he could somehow get them to find a way to rise above the overwhelming situation, then they could warrant an openly miraculous situation whereby even Paro, whose heart was hardened, would listen and let them go even earlier than they were supposed to go, even before the plagues had begun. Not that they don't get an open miracle right through the plagues, but Paro letting them go was not the miracle. The miracle was the plagues themselves, right? By the time we get to the 10th plague, the fact that Paro said, get out of here, no one's surprised. No one's calling that a miracle at that point. Paro letting them go was not the miracle. The miracle was the plagues. But Moshe felt in this situation, he could get them out even earlier. If only he could get them under those circumstances to listen to him anyway, then it could be Hashem would now kick into the above nature miracle where Hashem would miraculously allow Paro to listen just like that and then have them go. And that was Moshe's argument. If Bnei Yisrael did not listen to me, then Kal v'chomer, Paro won't listen to me. Meaning, I know Moshe knew full well this wasn't the moment of redemption. But he thought he could pull a fast one by getting Bnei Yisrael to really believe under those circumstances, which would open the doors to an openly miraculous situation, and then get Paro to listen. But once he saw Bnei Yisrael didn't listen, he knew Kal v'chomer, Paro wouldn't. Then the Torah interrupts the narrative to describe the lineage of Moshe and Aaron. It actually describes Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, but as Rashi and others tell us, that was just to lead up to Moshe and Aaron. Then come the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice, which we will not be reviewing this year. Then Paro's heart continues to be hardened, first on his own and ultimately by Hashem. So many commentators are very bothered by the seeming lack of free will on Paro's part. And they offer many reasons why it is not a violation of the principle of man having free will. But one of the most satisfying answers was given to me by Rabbi Yossi Jankowitz based on the Sforno, who basically explains that the plagues were the artificial removal of free will, not Paro's heart being hardened by Hashem. In truth, if Hashem had brought the plagues against Paro without hardening Paro's heart, then guess what? Paro would have let us go free right away. But it wouldn't have been from his own free will. He would have let us go because he didn't like the plagues. They didn't feel very good. He wanted to stop that. So therefore, it would be due to the plagues that he freed them, not due to his own free will. So by hardening his heart, Hashem merely neutralized the impact that the plagues had on him so that he could choose now what he really wanted to do. You know, it was like anesthetizing him. When it says hardening his heart, it means it essentially anesthetized his heart, and therefore he was able to endure the pain and then make a proper free will situation. He gives a mashal of a science experiment. Imagine we had a science experiment where you put mice in a cage and then you put a piece of cheese in the far corner. So of course the mice will go and eat the cheese. Now imagine that they insert an electric shocker in the cheese, so every time a mouse nibbles on the cheese, zap, he gets a zap, he gets a shock. So what do you think is going to happen? After a few attempts, the mice are going to stop trying to eat the cheese. But now why is it? Does it mean that the mouse does not want the cheese anymore? Of course not. Of course they want the cheese. Of its own free will, it wants the cheese. It's not eating it simply because it doesn't want to get zapped. And that is what happened to Paro. Did he want of his own free will to continue torturing and enslaving the Jews? Of course he did. But each time he got zapped. So after a while, he wants to free them. Not because he really wants to, it's just he wants to stop getting zapped. So Hashem has to harden his heart in order to allow him to endure the pain so he can truly make a free will decision. Which ultimately doesn't happen anyway. He doesn't make the right choice, right? In the end run, Hashem has to bring all 10 plagues, and he's essentially forced to do it. There are other reasons why Hashem goes through that exercise anyway, among them to glorify his name, but nonetheless, that is how we can understand hardening his heart being the way to bring out his free will. And that, of course, is the reason, by the way, why Hashem does not punish us each time we sin, each time we transgress the Torah. Because if people got zapped every time they did something wrong, then their teshuvah, or their lack of doing something wrong, would not be based on free will. It would be based on wanting to be pain-free, or as I like to call it, pain-free will, because that's what it really would be. We don't like to get zapped. So if every time you turned on a light on Shabbos, electrical volts go through you, you're going to stop turning on that light, but not because you believe anymore, not because you want to follow God's will, but rather because you don't like that feeling of getting zapped all the time. And therefore, Hashem gives us a chance to do teshuvah on our own. Then comes the final plague in this week's Parsha, Barad, hail. We've actually spoken extensively on this plague in previous years, analyzing why it may or may not be the most severe of all the plagues, based on what may or may not be a misreading of Rashi, and perhaps we'll revisit that again in future years. You can also read, I have an essay in one of my books all about this, which might give you some illumination as well. In any event, this year I just want to note one unusual aspect of that plague and then come back to see what we can extract from that after we return to the beginning of the Parsha. So after Paro begs Moshe to pray for the cessation of the plague of hail, Moshe says to him, page 338, Pasuk 29, something that is out of the ordinary. He says, Vayomer elav Moshe, Kitsesi es ha'ir, Efrosh es kapai el Hashem, Efros es kapai el Hashem, Hakolos yachtalun, Labare lo yaod, Laman tedaki l'Hashem ha'aretz. Says Moshe to Paro, when I leave the city, I shall spread out my hands to Hashem, the thunder will cease, and the hail will be no longer, so that you'll know the earth is Hashem's. So that is unusual because nowhere else does Moshe say he must leave the city to pray. We're going to return to this in a little while to see what Rashi, Ramban, and others have to say about this and what we can learn about it, but let's just note that for now. Now let's return to the beginning of the Parsha and Hashem's dialogue with Moshe. That's page 318. As Rashi told us, Hashem was angry with Moshe for questioning his ways, contrasting him unfavorably with the Avos. The second pasuk, which I did not read fully to you, tells us that Hashem has a complaint against Moshe vis-a-vis the Avos. We'll look at that second Rashi first on Pasuk Gimel. Let's see. Ushmi Hashem lo nodati lehem. Lo nodati en ksiv kan ela lo nodati. So it's not written lo hodati, I did not make known, but lo nodati, I was not known. Meaning, lo nichrati lehem b'midas emes, shali shaleh nikra shmi Hashem, neman lemes dvarai, sharei ivtachtim v'lo kiyamti. So, the further scolding of Moshe by Hashem takes the following form. Hashem compares Moshe unfavorably to the Avos in that he's saying, I was not recognized by them with my attribute of fulfilling my word. And that would be if I had used my name Yud, and then the Hey, and then the Vav, and then the Hey. And that is my attribute that they did not know me by, but that is the attribute I use when I am fulfilling my word at the present. Rather, they knew me as Kel Shakai, because faithful to fulfill my word, for indeed I made them promises but did not fulfill them during their lifetime. In other words, Hashem is saying that I made them promises that would not be fulfilled in their lifetime, and they truly believed in me. They truly had faith that I would do that. You, Moshe, on the other hand, you are going to see this fulfilled in your lifetime, and yet you question me. So he is contrasting Moshe unfavorably with that. And Hashem sends this message through the use of his different names, representing his different attributes, as we had mentioned before, and as Rashi highlights as well, that they were only known by Kel Shakai. That's how the Avos knew Hashem, referring to the fact of fulfilling promises in the future. Whereas Moshe, he's showing himself to as the Yud, and then the Hey, and then the Vav, and then the Hey. Hashem's ineffable name. So Rav Soloveitchik has a very interesting analysis of this, which we're going to read and then use as a springboard for other things. So he says that Chazal point out that Hashem was very critical of Moshe's argument, right? Where Moshe complains, Lama hareo, so why have you made it worse for these people, right? Hashem feels that's chutzpahdik, so to speak. And he notes first and foremost that a similar criticism was leveled against Shlomo HaMelech. What is the background behind that? So the Medrash tells us that, and as we know, the Torah enjoins kings, the Jewish kings, the Israelite kings, from having too many wives. They have a restriction on how many wives that they are allowed to have. And as we know, quite famously or infamously, Shlomo violates that prohibition. It's an 18-wife maximum. Why he would want to go above that, I'm not sure, but he decides he wants more wives. Now, the Torah specifically says that the king should not have too many wives so that they will not sway the king from wholeheartedly serving Hashem. Shlomo reasoned that this rationale did not apply to him. His belief in Hashem was so ironclad and could never be weakened, no matter how many wives he would have. Chazal indicate that at that moment that Shlomo decided to violate this command, that he decided, I'm going to take on more wives, the letter Yud from the word Yarbeh, the pasuk tells us lo yarbeh lo nashim, and he should not increase or have too many wives for himself. He should not take too many wives for himself. So the Yud from that word Yarbeh came to Hashem to complain that Shlomo was ignoring the mitzvah. Why the Yud? Why did the Yud complain? Because in the Hebrew language, the Yud is the letter prefix for a verb that indicates the future tense, right? Yarbeh, Yehiyah. If the Yud is in the front, that is referring to the future. The Yud argued that while initially Shlomo's heart would indeed be unaffected, he did not recognize that in the future his situation would change. When he became older and weaker and his mental capacities were not as sharp, we learned that in fact his wives did sway him, whether they built actual altars to Avodah Zarah or not. It's clear that they introduced that element into the Malchus over there, and therefore Shlomo in fact failed, and in fact he was incorrect. He did not prevent them from swaying his heart. Says Rav Soloveitchik, this same Yud criticized Moshe because in his argument with Hashem, Moshe made a mistake that involved this very same letter. When Hashem sent Moshe to Paro for the first time, he did not reveal himself with what we call the Shem Havaya, with the Yud and then the Hey and then the Vav and then the Hey. That's not how he introduced himself to Moshe. And what's significant about that, and there's a cool thing to know, when Hashem uses that name, the Yud and then the Hey and then the Vav and then the Hey, it is there to represent all tenses, past tense, present tense, and future tense. Why do we say that? Because of the letters in that name. You have Haya, it's a Yud and then a Hey and then a Vav and then a Hey. So you have Haya in there, which means was. You have Hoveh, which means present. And then you have Yehiyah. Now, there's only one Yud in the Yud and then the Hey and then the Vav and the Hey, but somehow that works because it's just those two letters. So you have Haya, Hoveh, and Yehiyah encompassed in that one name. Therefore, when Hashem uses that name, he's speaking of past, present, and future. Therefore, Hashem only says to Moshe, he only speaks to Moshe in the past and the future. Hashem says to Moshe, I am the God of your forefathers, speaking of the past. And then, as we see on Pasuk 14, actually in the previous Parsha, Parat Gimel Pasuk 13, on page 304, it says, Vayomer Moshe Elokim, right? This is after the burning bush, and now he's agreed to go, and Moshe says to Hashem, I'm coming before them, and I'm telling them the God of their forefathers has sent me, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? And what does Hashem answer? Vayomer Elokim el Moshe, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be what I will be. Okay, and we'll look at the Rashi on that a little later on, what that means. But that is future tense. So Hashem has spoken to Moshe, past tense, referring to himself as the God of his forefathers, who he promised to take their children out of Mitzrayim. And he speaks to the future, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. But what he doesn't speak to is the present. By omitting the part of his name which represents the present, Hashem was in effect saying that while Jews were still being persecuted now, the present cannot be understood. I can tell you about the past, I'll tell you what's going to happen. Right now, you're too close to it. You can't understand what's happening. At the burning bush, Hashem had already warned Moshe, as we referenced before, that Paro was not going to let the people go immediately. Right? That there was still going to be a lot of tribulation before the redemption. Moshe, therefore, says Hashem, should accustom himself to relating to Hashem only via the Yud, the future, what was going to happen to Bnei Israel. Don't look at what's happening now. I'm telling you, don't focus on the present. Only focus on the future. They will be redeemed. When Paro rejects Moshe's message, Moshe has trouble handling that because Moshe wants to deal in the present as well, as we all would want to. So Moshe has trouble when Paro rejects Moshe's initial attempt, and Moshe returns to Hashem to complain using the term, if you look on page 316, Pasuk 22, he uses the term that was at the end of last week's Parsha. He uses, what did I say? Pasuk 22. He uses Vayeshev Moshe el Hashem Vayomer Aleph Daled Nun Yud. He is using that name of Hashem, the one present, saying, I want some salvation for them right now. I need something now. Why have you dealt badly with the people, and why have you sent me? Means, since I've come to to Paro, to speak in your name, he's harmed these people. It's made it an even worse situation. The present is terrible right now. I need to focus on the present, Hashem. Now, both Moshe, and whatever, we'll skip that, what Hashem's reaction could have been to Moshe. He says, really, Hashem was tempted to kill Moshe at that moment, but he says because of Bnei Yisrael, he's reflecting their anxiety. I'm not going to punish Moshe like that, even though Hashem had warned him, don't focus on the present. He sends him. Moshe has trouble integrating that idea, comes back and complains to Hashem. It says, why is it getting even worse for them? Hashem says, I just told you, don't focus on the present. But he does tell him, in the future, it is going to be a promise that was fulfilled in future generations. And while Hashem tells Moshe that he would begin the redemption immediately, he at the same time contrasts Moshe's behavior unfavorably with the forefathers. Now we can understand Rashi. Rashi tells us, as opposed to them, where I told them something in the future and they don't even get a chance to live to see it, you will get to live to see this. But don't focus on the present. And that's a very important lesson for us. First and foremost, especially with our tefillos, first and foremost, forget about whether or not Hashem answers our prayers in the classic sense, meaning of saying yes. Putting that aside, Hashem always answers our prayers. So the answer is not always yes, but either way, even if we want to say we expect a yes anyway, our bigger problem is that we also often think that the yes must come right now. Hashem, I need Parnasa. It's 2 days later, you're like, hello, God, did you not hear me? I said I need Parnasa. So we very often not only want the answer to be yes, but we want it now. We want it now, Daddy. That's our attitude. But in fact, that's the wrong attitude. I remember I heard Rabbi Franz speak in Boca many, many years ago. It has to be at least 15 years ago. And he was talking about the Baal Tshuva movement. And he was talking about the fact that, I think he said it in the name of the Ben Ish Chai, I'm not certain, but he was using it to explain a different idea. Where did this whole Baal Tshuva movement come from? Let's say starting in the 70s or 80s, wherever we can pinpoint it. Out of nowhere. People returning to the faith left and right. Where did this all come from? He says the following idea. You know what was happening at the beginning of the 20th century? You know how many Jews were going off the derech? How they were swayed by the Haskalah movement, the Enlightenment, or Marxism, or communism, etc. There were all these frum Jews that left the derech. But do you know, he said, they're bubbies. What do you think those bubbies were doing? They were standing there all day, saying Tehillim, crying, davening for their children to return, davening that Hashem should allow them to come back into the fold. And guess what? Hashem said, okay. It's just that Hashem didn't say okay right then. Hashem said, I will bottle your tefillos. And then one day, I am in fact going to grant them. And that's why, inexplicably, you could have decades and decades later, out of nowhere, people returning, Hashem did say yes. It wasn't immediate. See, we can't handle that. We think, I need a yes and I need it now. It's not the way it works. Sometimes it is in fact a yes. That which we want. Just the timing is not what we envision that's best for us. So based on that, by the way, we can also understand what would be, we can understand that it's one thing not to focus on the present, but only the future. However, this can also help us understand what would appear to be a contradiction in Rashi. If you turn to page 304, again from last week's, it's even from 2 weeks ago, from Parsha Shmos, on Pasuk 14. What happens there? Now Moshe has received that answer that we just spoke of, last week in Parsha Shmos, that we just referenced, Ehyeh, right? Vayomer Elokim el Moshe, Ehyeh asher Ehyeh. I will be what I will be. And what does Rashi tell us? Something fascinating. Ehyeh imam b'tzara zos, asher Ehyeh imam b'shibud shar malchios. So Hashem says, I will be what I will be. Why does it use that term twice? Ehyeh, asher Ehyeh. Hashem is telling you, I will be with you now in this suffering, in this exile. And I will be with them in future exiles, in future times when the Jews are persecuted and when they're exiled. I'll be with them also. What does Moshe say? Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam, mani maskir lehem tzara acheres, dayim b'tzara zo. Moshe says, God, what do I need to tell them? Now you want me to also let them know, by the way, in the future, there's going to be bad stuff again? It's bad enough, I need to just tell them now. I know it's bad, Hashem is with us. You want me to tell them, and by the way, in the future, when things are horrible again, Hashem will be with us again. And what does Moshe, and what does Hashem respond? Amar lo yafa amarta. And Hashem says, nice job, Moshe. Touche. I agree. Don't give them Ehyeh, asher Ehyeh. Just say Ehyeh. So now that's a little bit hard to understand. Because here it seems that Hashem commends Moshe for not focusing on the future and only on the present. Whereas here in our Parsha, Hashem scolds Moshe for focusing on the present and not the future. So what's happening over here? So perhaps we can suggest that it's one thing not to focus on future suffering. Right? That could cause despair. But Moshe takes it to a new level here. Moshe wants instant gratification. Hashem, you send me, I said something, no, let's go. Let's get them out of here. What's happening? That's another thing Hashem is saying. That's not the way it works. Yes, good point. Don't stress them out about future bad stuff, but different point. Don't focus on the now. I told you can't see the now. It's something we all suffer from today, right? How did it start? I get started with telegrams and telegraphs. Then we got 2-day overnights. Then it became the overnight. Then it became the fax machine. Then email, tweeting, texting, everything like that. We are in a total instant gratification society right now. When I grew up, probably because I'm the product of Eastern European parents, so we had no microwave. It was bad for you. Don't look at it, whatever. We didn't have a color TV either. We'll go into that another time. We didn't have the microwave, okay? But now, I'm tapping on the microwave in 90 seconds to cook my dinner. I'm like, no, let's go already. I need my dinner. It's been 90 seconds I've been waiting for my dinner. Right? That's what happens. But that's not the way things work. Not in the greater realm. That's not how it goes. As we said before, those tefillos of those babis took decades and decades until they were finally realized, until they were said yes to. That's the way it works. Which brings us to our final topic of the hail. As we said, we have a few commentators that we're going to look at. The first of which is Rashi, page 338, pasuk 29. This is when Moshe says to Paro, Moshe Ketsesi Yasair Ephros Eskapaya Hashem Makos Yachdalun, etc. Moshe says, when I go out of the city, then I will spread out my hands, meaning I will daven to Hashem. So what does Rashi say on that? And what was bothering Rashi exactly? Ketsesi Yasair, Rashi says, Min ha'ir, when I leave the city. Aval b'toch ha'ir lo hispalo. But inside the city, I'm not going to pray. The fisha haisa malaya gelulim, because it was filled with idols. So that's very interesting, because what was bothering Rashi? What was bothering Rashi is the fact that, hey, this is a feature we haven't seen before. Never before does Moshe mention that he needs to go outside of the city to pray. Now he's saying it. Why? Because apparently there were idols inside the city, and therefore he could not pray there. So Rashi solves one question but creates another one. So now we understand why, but the problem is that we've never seen this feature before, that Moshe would have to leave the city to pray. We can assume he was always praying in the city each time. So what's going on over here? And in fact, Moshe twice states by the frogs and by the wild animals that he will pray for it to cease. Yet we see no such language that he has to leave the city in order to do so. So the Ramban actually says that although there too Moshe left the city in order to pray to Hashem, it was unnecessary for him to mention it. So they hold, in fact, each time, those other times too, Moshe did leave the city in order to pray. It's just that the Torah didn't find it necessary to mention, or rather Moshe didn't find it necessary to mention that to Paro. Why? Since he was only required to pray that the plague would cease the next day. Here, however, Paro requests that it cease immediately. And therefore, Moshe was required to explain to Paro, okay, immediately, yes, but understand, not immediate, I still need to leave the city so I can pray, so then it can cease. Okay, so Rashi notes that this is the first time that Moshe does this, that he leaves the city. Ramban disagrees, and he holds that, in fact, he did it each time, but he did not need to mention it the previous times. Now let's look at the Chanukas Torah. So the Chanukas Torah asks a similar question, asks why was Moshe compelled to leave this time? And he says the following, beautiful answer. As we well know, of course, the Egyptians worshipped their sheep and cattle. That was their gods, of course, as we well know. Usually, the sheep and cattle were outside the city, grazing in the fields, right? So, no problem. And the city was free of them. But the Torah tells us that in anticipation of the impending plague of hail, right, on page 336, Pasuk 20, what does it tell us? Hayarei Dvar Hashem me'avdei Paro, heinis es avodav es mignei elabatim. Those that feared the word of Hashem, those Egyptians that did, chased his livestock and his servants to the houses. They brought the cattle indoors into their houses in the city because they were afraid that were they out in the fields, they would, whatever was still remaining would get all wiped out. Thus the sheep and cattle were within the city after the plague of hail. Therefore, because the city was now filled with the objects of Egyptians' idolatry, Moshe had to leave the city in order to find a place where he could pray to God. Okay? So now let's see, the Chanukas Torah agrees with Rashi that this was the very first time that Moshe leaves the city. But he has an explanation as to why it would be that he felt compelled this time, that there were these idols that prevented him from praying, but previously it did not, because up until then people didn't have their sheep and cattle inside the city limits, so it was not an issue for him. Now let's look finally at the Shem Mishmuel, who takes a different angle than them, and with that we can bring it all together. Shemi Shmuel asks the same question, only this time he comes from a different angle. He says, it's hard to understand, even accepting the Chanukah Torah, even accepting Rashi, it's hard to understand that somehow Moshe is forbidden to pray in a city where there are idols. Because in fact, so he actually holds that the frogs and the locusts, Moshe did pray, but as we said, and according to Rashi, he prayed inside the city. So he said, what is it? I don't understand. It didn't prevent him before. Why does it prevent him now from davening? Notwithstanding the Chanukah Torah's answer. So he says, amazing. First he said, let's examine the special nature of the plague of Barad that was different than every other plague. When it says that that Moshe brought it, page 336, pasuk 22, it says, "Vayom Hashem al Moshe, neteyes yadecha al hashamayim." Spread out your hands upon. You see, catching art scroll again, interpretation, not translation. They say, stretch out your hand toward heaven. But really, it means, al hashamayim means upon heaven, on top of heaven. Says Rashi right there, noting that. Rashi says, Litzad Hashmayim. So he agrees with their first interpretation towards heaven, but then he says, Umedrash Agada, Hagbiu HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Moshe L'mala ben Hashamayim. Hashem, for this plague, lifted Moshe up above the heavens. For this plague and this plague only, Moshe needed to be above the heavens. And as the Shemi Shmuel points out, it uses almost the same terminology for the Makas Choshech, for the plague of darkness. Yet there, Rashi does not say that he needed to put Moshe above the heavens. Only here. So it appears that hail required some additional effort than any other of the plagues, such that Moshe needed to go above the heavens in order for it to be able to be brought down. And as we know, it was an extraordinary miracle. Just 2 psukim later, how does it describe it? Vayhi vorad ve'esh mislakachas b'toch habarad. There was hail and fire flaming amid the hail. Fire hail. Imagine that. That was fire and hail together. Now, Rashi, again, bothered by that, states again, just for brevity, says, Nes b'toch nes. Ha'esh v'abarad morven. V'abarad mayimhu. So he says it was a miracle within a miracle, because hail is water, and as we all know, water and fire do not mix. So it was a miracle within a miracle, he says, and that he who created them as opposites, meaning God, had them make peace with each other, water and fire, in order to bring down this page. So based on that, the Shemi Shmuel says the following idea. Now there was actually, he points out, there's precedent for, at least in Shamayim, for having water and fire together, because in fact that is the makeup of heaven. Rebbe Abba says in Parshas Rabbah that, in the name of Rebbe, that Hashem took fire and water and mixed them together, and that's how they made the heavens. That's why it's called Shamayim. Eish Mayim. Shamayim. That's why it was called that name. So that is already a place where they had made peace. But now Hashem needs, so in order for it to exist in Shamayim, it has to come from a place higher than Shamayim. There's somewhere higher than the heavens that would need to dictate that in the heavens we're going to have them make peace. And it is precisely in that place that Hashem needed to bring Moshe. He needed to go to a world above the heavens to bring forth the miraculous, apparently contradictory hail. So based on that, he says the following, the Shemi Shmuel. Now that we appreciate the unusual nature of the hail, we can address why Moshe could not pray for its cessation while still in Paro's city. Chazal tell us, and this is the halacha, that there are certain impediments to our prayer, namely the presence of dung or of idols or other dirty substances. If those are extant where you are, you may not daven in front of them. But when those are covered or out of sight, then there's no problem davening. Likewise, of course, as we know, we live in a world of, let's call it impurity. So we're not the case. We would never be able to daven. So what is this telling us? So it's telling us that Why then did Moshe feel it necessary to leave the city to pray? We have already seen that the hail plague was most unusual. A tremendously great spiritual force was needed to instigate it. Likewise, we can suggest that a similar force was needed to stop the hail. Moshe's tefillah to God for the end of the plague was not a regular prayer of the sort described in Chazal. It was one that stretched the limits of human ability, even for Moshe, demanding complete concentration and a perfect environment. The proximity of an idol, even in the same city, was enough to disturb the tefillah and prevent it from reaching its destination. Thus Moshe left the city to pray to ensure he would be successful. With the foregoing in mind, we can extract a very important lesson for us. We live in the world. We can't always control our environment, and thus that reality is reflected in the fact that we can pray and have our tefillos reach the heavens from any setting, provided there's no excrement, idols, etc. But that should not be confused with ultimate tefillos, the most important ones, which can only be achieved from a proper and pristine environment. And how much more so when we can control the environment. It's one thing when it's out of our control, but making a mess in shul, kids dropping stuff on the floor, not being picked up, people joking around and not taking shul experience seriously, constant or even intermittent talking. Like Shlomo HaMelech, we think we can talk at certain less important times when it's not during Chazaras HaShatz. That's not how it works, though. Like we learned from Shlomo's error, eventually it leads to our talking at the worst times. I am sorry to say over the past few years, I saw in certain shuls, thank God not the one I daven in, a phenomenon I never thought I would see. People talking during Kedusha. During Kedusha. I had never seen that in all my years. That seemed to be the one immutable fact that nobody would speak during Kedusha for those 30 seconds, right? That was one thing everybody knew, everybody understood. But really, it's no surprise. It's just a natural succession. I remember some years ago during a weekly davening, there was someone talking incessantly during davening, and I kept looking over at him. And eventually, he comes over to me, during Kaddish no less, and starts making conversation with me, right? I keep looking over at him. Guy's constantly talking. He comes over and starts making conversation with me. I think he thought I kept looking at him because I was insulted or something that he wasn't talking to me. I guess I was his chesed project. He was doing a little kiruv with me. But it's crazy because we don't even think about it anymore. And we don't think about it anymore because it's a natural succession. The little things turn into the bigger things. If you really want your tefillos to reach the heavens, they may be able to when you daven from a less than pristine environment. But if you want them to reach above the heavens, then as we learned from Moshe, that is only possible in a perfect environment. One that we create in shul, one that is physically clean, respected by all, and one which contains no foreign entities. That does not just mean strange gods, but even strange words, ones that are not part of davening. As we learned from the mistake of Shlomo, eventually it leads to strange gods. So we need to be mindful of little transgressions in the present, since although we think we know how to prevent them from leading to larger ones in the future, the little Yud's Musar to Shlomo HaMelech taught us otherwise. The Yud understood that when it comes to the consequences of our actions and where they may lead, as well as the answer to many of our tefillos, that may only become clear in the future, regardless of how things look right now. But when it comes to guiding our actions and focusing on our tefillos, we need to have the presence of mind to keep our mind on the present. Good Shabbos, and there will be no video the next 2 weeks.